Hello and welcome back to the Robotic Enterprise Framework Training. Now that we've edited the config file and added the workflows to open, close, and kill the applications used in the process, it's time to dive into the get transaction data and process transaction states. In this demo, we'll check if the queue item retrieval mechanism needs changes, update values used for logging, invoke the workflow to process the data, and configure the mechanism for catching business rule exceptions. Are you ready? Let's begin by configuring getTransactionData.xaml. By default, this workflow is set up to use orchestrator queue items. The getQueueItem activity retrieves transaction items one by one from the orchestrator queue defined in the config file. There are times when retrieving a transaction item from the orchestrator queue can fail due to technical issues or network problems. As a result, this activity is enclosed in both a try-catch block and a retry block to overcome these types of exceptions. Similar to queue names, the config file specifies the number of retries for retry scope activity. Since we're also working with transaction items of queue items, this out-of-the-box reframework works fine for our process, so no changes are required to this activity. Next, let's check the logging mechanism. Here, we'll need to set proper values to a custom log field to include more information about each transaction item. These custom log fields will come in handy if we plan to build reporting dashboards later. But first, let's focus on the transaction ID or transaction identifier. Its value is used to uniquely identify the transaction. For example, if we have invoice data in the queue items, we could use the invoice ID for this field. Our queue items do not hold a transaction identifier by default. What does this mean? If we display the details of a transaction in Orchestrator, we can see the three fields: cash in, on us check, and not on us check. However, there's no field to identify the transaction. The transaction ID will be assigned at process execution. Since it must be unique, let's leave the value field of the assign activity set to the current timestamp. Next, we have the transaction field 1 and transaction field 2, where we can add any additional details. In our case, we'll set the first field to the concatenation of the three values retrieved from the out_transaction item argument: cash in, on us check, and not on us check. Note that to extract values from an object of type queue item, we use the specific content property and provide the name of the field as the key. Great, we're all set with the getTransactionData workflow and state. Let's save our file. Please keep the checklist in mind. We can use it to ensure that we don't leave out configuration steps when building a project. Next, let's concentrate on the process.xaml file invoked in the process transaction state. This workflow is used to invoke the major steps of the business process. In our case, it's used to type the data from the transaction item into the UI demo application and to click accept. As process.xaml is empty by default, here we invoke the pre-configured uidemo_addTransaction.xaml file. Note that we've prepared this workflow in advance, so it is not part of the template. However, we should keep in mind the business rule that we have. The rule states that if the total amount which is to be entered for a transaction exceeds 10,000, then it must not be processed automatically and should be checked by a human. When the robot encounters this situation during processing, it must throw a business rule exception. Of course, this check is performed before typing the values into UI demo. The first thing that we need to do to configure the business rule is to get the data from the transaction item. Note that the input data for the add transactions workflow is of type decimal, while the input data stored in the transaction item is of type object. We need to convert the latter to the decimal type. Alright, let's return to process.xaml and add a multiple assign to retrieve and convert the transaction item values. We'll create the three variables of type decimal: cash in, on us check, and not on us check. Now we'll assign to the cache-in variable the result of the expression. See dec in transaction item dot specific content cache-in. This expression returns the value for the cache-in key from the transaction item and converts it from the object type to the decimal type. Let's add the same for the other two fields. We can simply copy and paste the expression and change the key to on us check and not on us check. Of course, let's not forget to rename the activity and add an annotation explaining what it does. Next, we need to implement the business logic required to make sure that the input data is valid. We'll create a separate sequence for this. Let's rename it Input Data Validation and add an annotation to explain the business rule. Before we start working on this sequence, do you remember where we've defined the threshold, or what activity we must use to define and trigger the business rule exception? We'll get to the answers in a few moments, but before that, we must compute the sum of the values stored in the transaction item. Cache in plus on us check plus not on us check, and assign it to a new variable that we create now, transaction sum. Of course, we need to change the type of transaction sum to system.decimal. Next, we need to check if transaction sum is greater than the value assigned to the manual transaction threshold key in the config file. Let's add an if activity. The condition is transaction sum is greater than in config manual transaction threshold. Let's not forget that we need to convert the second element to decimal. We'll rename it OK, so if the condition is true, we use a throw activity in the then branch to throw the business rule exception. Of course, we also need to set the value for the exception argument. We throw a business rule exception where we add a custom message that the sum of values associated to the transaction item exceeds the maximum value allowed by the threshold. Let's do a quick recap. We've implemented the input data validation. If the data is not valid, then it'll throw a business exception. In other words, if the sum of the cache-in on us check, not on us check values equals more than 10,000, then the process will throw the business exception and will save the transaction for manual processing. The robot will log these details. The queue item will get the status failed in Orchestrator with the error type business, and the robot will move to the next transaction. But if the data is valid, the automation will process the transaction. We do this by invoking the UIDemo_add_transaction workflow. This workflow takes 3 input arguments of type decimal, cache-in, on us check, and not on us check. Now we just need to map them to the workflow variables. For the out_transaction number argument, let's create a new variable to store its value, transaction number. Let's go ahead and save this workflow as well. With this, we've completed configuring the process.xaml file and the entire project. Before we end the video, we want to take a moment to draw your attention to the best practices used in this project. We've added meaningful names for the activities used and annotations to explain each step. Also, we've grouped the activities into components based on the specific actions performed. This will allow us to save the components to libraries and reuse them in other processes. Great! We've now updated our process with logging values and invoked our custom-built workflow to process the data, as well as configured activities to catch the business rule exceptions. With this, we conclude building the UI demo process. In the next video, we'll do a test run to see how it performs. We encourage you to review the business process, transaction data and process section of the Reframework with Q items checklist. Here are a few reflection points after building this process. What workflow did we configure in the Get Transaction Data state? Why did we make those changes? What workflow did we configure in the Process Transaction state? Where did we define the business rule? What activities did we use to configure the business rule? Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy automation!